Welcome to the American Intelligence Media. I'm your host, Douglas Gabriel, and today I'm with Michael McKibben, our good friend, to continue the most outrageous insight that Mr. McKibben and his researchers, and now he's got some amazing researchers. I should warn the British royalty, you better watch out, because now there are researchers who are able to find out all about you. And that's where we're going today. There were some missing pieces to a recent video we did where people asked some questions where, yes, we know the answers to those, but we just didn't have enough time. So we need to carry on. And what we're carrying on with is some new insight, because previous research that McKibben and friends have done with Marconi and RCA, those my age out there, remember that RCA ruled the world because they ruled televisions and radios and wireless communication. And when Guglielmo Marconi invented wireless, they did the same thing to him that they did to everything, turn it into a monopoly. So we had studied this before and brought it before you because it had to do with Serco, to show that the British Royal Crown controls so much of our technology through Serco in America under the auspices of, just American contracts, which they are not. They are actually British companies working through American companies. This has been going on from the beginning. And Marconi and RCA, which then was really always owned by, well, not always, but partially, repeatedly owned by General Electric. When I was in the NSA, you might as well have said we worked for General Electric, because they owned all the equipment and they had all the money. And when you didn't work for the NSA, then they hired you to work for GE. So sorry if people don't know that. We didn't mention some of these things before. But what the researchers have found out is that from the moment that wireless was created, and mind you, wireless was created about the same time that the monopoly on kerosene oil and oil through Standard Oil became what then was Standard Oil, which had to be separated into the Seven Sisters. Those seven oil companies still control the world, by the way. At the same time, on the other hand, technology was being developed, electronic technology. And
Can I interject a date there, Douglas? It's around 1906.
Yes, exactly. And even earlier on, as you pointed out, this started back
Yes.
in England in, I forget what year, but it was early on at the turn of the century. And then it slipped into Canada, and then it had a Canadian name, and then it slipped into America and had an American name, and then we all thought that RCA was American. Wrong. It belonged to the Queen and her Privy Council from the beginning, because one of our best friends from the Privy Council, Lord Paddy, was there from the beginning.
Sir Geoffrey
Paddy. And so we have pointed out that the Privy Council always controlled the media. And when we're talking about Marconi and we're talking about wireless, we're talking about the beginnings of media. And what we have noticed is that the Marconi company was the perfect archetypal example of what all technology companies became. It is the perfect model. It is what they built them all upon, called a monopoly. They absorbed every company that had anything to do with what they were working on, until RCA and GE was so big that basically they even controlled the military-industrial complex in terms of technology, both on this and the other side of the Atlantic. So when I'm talking about the Anglo-American axis, I'm talking about the British United Kingdom connected with America, and the fact, and this is what people were a little bit worried that I didn't understand, that Cecil Rhodes and his original round table had as their plan, their number one plan is to reconnect America to the United Kingdom as a Commonwealth nation. And that is what the Round Table was about, the Fabian Society, the Pilgrim Society, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and the Council on Foreign Relations. So, yes, we understand that, but we didn't go there yet. We didn't go to Milner, who was the number one proponent of Cecil Rhodes, who then led right into the Tavistock Institute. But what we did find is that from the beginning, the Tavistock Institute used a technology monopoly and lied and said that you could have secret messages sent across their wires. No, no. Just like today, there is nothing secret. If it goes across any wire, if it's wireless, if it is a transmission or broadcast, it is surveilled, it is controlled from the beginning. And it was that way from the beginning. And Marconi is the perfect example of that, and the perfect example of what Tavistock needed to manipulate Germany into World War I. And this is where we kind of left off with the last talk. But we wanted to let you know that, yes, we understand these things we've told you before, and though we didn't summarize them in the presentation last time, certainly those are the key, very, very key elements. And we could go into greater detail, the Hanseatic League and the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company. We've said these things many times before, and unfortunately we do assume that you may know some of these things from listening to Americans for Innovation and for Aim for Truth. But the new research is what's fascinating, and that's what Michael is going to tell you about today, because now these researchers get down into the details of the lineages and the dynasties of these corrupt monopolies that have controlled things from the beginning, and it goes always back to the Privy Council. Michael, what have you found out recently?
We discovered in looking at the beginnings of wireless technology, which was invented by Marconi in Italy. And once the markets began to realize how important that technology was going to be moving forward, there were many meetings in the British cabinet and in various organizations looking at how they were going to allow this technology to be exploited in not only the UK, but also the US and around the world. And that was all occurring before World War I. And what we have now discovered is that the British cabinet at number 10 Downing Street was meeting on this very subject in January of 1914, which was prior to the beginning of World War I. And we now see what were then secret meeting minutes from the cabinet discussing how they were going to give the Marconi Company, which had been incorporated in the UK and the US, how they were going to give them a monopoly on all wireless traffic that was sent to and from British steamships. And for those that don't really understand how significant that is, back in the day, the Brits at that time ruled the sea. And steamship companies were spread out all over the planet. And so they used the idea that they wanted to improve passenger safety on these steamships as the excuse for authorizing an act that would allow the Marconi Company to have a monopoly on the communications to and from these steamships. So that was in 1914. We now see that very set of minutes was written by the president of the Board of Trade that sat on the British cabinet. And the interesting thing is that two previous members of that cabinet, of the presidents of that Board of Trade, were Winston Churchill and Lord Lloyd George prior to that. And then the cabinet member who presented the information for the Marconi monopoly was a gentleman by the name of Sidney Buxton, who shortly thereafter left that board and I'm sure started capitalizing on the market that was being created by Marconi. Now, the interesting thing is you can just Google it right now and just Google the Marconi scandal. And what you'll see is a discussion of the accusations that flew immediately that members of the British cabinet were financially benefiting from stock that they held either directly or indirectly with either Marconi UK or Marconi US. And so it's really rather humorous and sad that the very inception of wireless communications on our planet was steeped in greed and controversy. And what we now see is that the British cabinet intended to control the use of wireless communication around the planet from the beginning. And that included almost immediately, so that was in January of 1914, and then on August 5th of 1914, the British Navy pulled up the transatlantic cable that connected the U.S. with Germany and cut that cable. So that what they did in cutting that cable is they forced the Germans to start using their wireless technology that they were also implementing, and they forced them to start using encryption, which clearly the British were already using through their steamship systems throughout the planet. And the other curious thing is we now see the actual cabinet meeting minutes where they discussed having the Crown agents establish a wireless station in the Bahamas, which, as we all know now, is one of those major offshore banking systems that populate the planet. So I think I'll stop there and see what you may have to say about that.
So from the first, it seems as if the moment technology gave us certain capacities, then the absolute dregs of the vices of humanity come streaming in as fast as they can. And strangely enough, the ones who have the greatest greed and lust and desire for power are those who already have it. And so we see literally the monarchy, we see the British cabinet, we see the Privy Council, and we see then, of course, Imperial Germany, we see the Dutch, we see all of the monarchies all reacting to the fact that they believe that they should control the monopoly. And that is true with everything during the World War I and World War II. It came to these war industry boards or other Secretary of State Dawes or Edwin Pauley. A few people controlled everything, and they allowed these monopolies to go on. They would simply say, yes, Mr. Rockefeller, you get to control oil for the entire world. And from that, we are still underneath the auspices of those monopolies. We now see that with technology. And we see the twistedness from the beginning. The moment that they could actually control it all and tell everyone that they could actually have secure communications, they surveilled everything. It all went back to the original, not even Italy, it went back to Britain, and that's where Marconi's company really got its foothold, was in Britain. And then they played like it was an American company, and then they played like it was an international company serving everyone. No, it was always British. It always had nefarious purposes.
The scandal tracked back stock that was purchased in the American version of Marconi back to cabinet ministers who made the decision to give Marconi the monopoly.
In other words, venture capital insider trading, which you describe with almost every single social media company, they all had insider trading information. They all knew about the government contracts coming. They all knew that they were going to become monopolies, and they all became filthy rich. And it was always insiders. It was always the elite, and particularly the British monarchy and those who are barons and lords, who I love to make fun of, and all the titled people. And entitled people in America, that means politicians, and that means judges, crooked judges. And so they all get set up, and they all get the insider track on Marconi, as Marconi then basically hides the fact that they're really also General Electric, and that as we're buying televisions, RCA televisions, and as we're buying RCA phonographs, and as we're buying all this equipment, nobody told you at the same time you were promoting war efforts. Both sides.
Right.
That's what was really going on.
We need to add a couple of layers to this story. So that was specifically about wireless technology, which has continued to develop to this day, and encryption which was immediately forced into play at the beginning of World War II in August of 1914, which they point to the cutting of that cable between Germany and the U.S. as the effective start of the war. And then what we see is that within, I can't remember the date on this, but within a short period of time, at the end of 1917, the British War Cabinet had initially set up something called the Wellington House, which was to handle the propaganda systems that they were going to use in World War I. And then by 1917, in the fall, they actually formalized that into a cabinet department called the Information Department. I was Freudian. The Information Department, which they labeled in the sidebar of that particular set of notes, the propaganda, war propaganda. So initially, the Wellington House was just propaganda, and what they did is they hired many novelists and writers of the time, which are like Rudyard Kipling and Conan Doyle and G.K. Chesterton, and very good writers. They hired them to basically write fiction about the Germans and to demonize them. And what they found in the reports that we now have, that those activities were very successful, and they describe some of their successes, some of their failures, and how they're refining this by 1917, 1918 in the actual minutes of the meetings of the War Cabinet. And then what we see is that in 1919, they morphed the Wellington House into the Tavistock Institute when they added the psychiatry layer to the propaganda system. So I think by then they really began to realize how powerful these propaganda memes were, and they truly were memes. They were graphics, they were cartoons, they were posters. They were the same kinds of things we see today in the memeing that occurs in social media. And what they realized back then is that's the way to get to the hearts and minds of the people and to embed false narratives in the psyche of the public, is just keep pushing a certain narrative. The pictures of abused children by German soldiers. There's even one article where they talk about the Germans used the bodies of prisoners of war to make soap and to build munitions. And there's this whole long article that appeared in the Times and in British newspapers describing in detail this supposed plant in Brussels where they did all this. And as we know now, that even British historians say that was a completely false story that they planted. But what they did is they demonized the Germans in order to get the British public to buy into the war. And so who's making money from the war, like you say? It's all the bankers and all the politicians who've got all the insider information, and they've already invested in the companies that are going to benefit from that war. So then you've got the electronic layer, you've got the encryption layer, you then have the Tavistock psychiatry layer added to this, and then you've got the City of London, UK banker layer, the financier layer, and you add all those together, and that is the unholy mix that has basically driven the entire 20th century, and now we are experiencing. And so what the fascinating thing we're seeing from this study is that from the very inception of wireless technology, which we're all comfortable with today, the greed, lust of the seven deadly sins have driven everything we know about technology. And what we need to do, I think, as human beings, is put a stop to this and raise our level of consciousness and realize how we have been victimized and abused by this group of power players who have used technology as a weapon against humanity itself.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself, but I'm going to try. It's psychological ops, right? It's psyops. People want to think that is a myth. That is a conspiracy theory. No, Facebook is a psyops. And Sir Richard Allen and well, I can't get all their titles right. Little Richie Allen.
He's a Baron. Baron Richard Allen.
Baron Richard Allen and Nick Clegg, Sir or Lord, I can't remember.
Sir Nick Clegg, Baron Richard Allen, run policy for Facebook worldwide now.
Fresh from the Queen's closest group of people, fresh from being members of Parliament, fresh from being the Deputy Prime Minister. They come over to run the Tavistock-driven Facebook. Now, we understand, and thank you so very much, those who contributed after the last
absolutely
talk. So
those folks these folks in England deserve a tremendous thanks from us Americans who are going to benefit from their deep research.
And of course, you pointed out that there's all kinds of groups in America, and that Stanford is basically Tavistock, that Columbia is Tavistock, that Georgetown is Tavistock, that Harvard, Yale, Tavistock,
Princeton.
Yes.
I mean, you see in their own minutes of the cabinet meetings, you see them discussing all of the players, or many of the players that we see just today, also contributing to helping disseminate the British propaganda. And one interesting aspect of this is they learned through the Wellington Institute before they started Tavistock that the best way to change the hearts and minds of a people, of a citizenry, to a false narrative is to do it slowly in drips. Don't inundate them with it, but do it a drip at a time. Drip, drip, drip. And eventually they found they could actually get people to believe any lie they wanted to tell.
And as they say, the bigger the lie, the easier it is to get people to believe it, because they don't think anybody could tell such a big lie. Well, the big lie is that Sir Geoffrey Patty was with Marconi when the monopoly for technologies was set up and then passed along through British secret agreements and companies that basically are asset management companies that changed their names, blah, 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 through Serco, until Serco owned 20, 30 different companies that were the initial electronic military companies, the companies that provided the military-industrial complex's electronic needs. Well, those are all...
Douglas, can I stop you there? Mm-hmm. I want to add a couple layers to Sir Geoffrey, because he also was the president of the Intellectual Property Institute in London in 1995, along with a number of other members of the Privy Council and also British peers. So you've got the intellectual property layer, you've got the Serco layer, you've got the Marconi layer. He was the last chairman of Marconi before they sold out to British Aerospace, which is run by the Queen's Golden Chair and is tied at the hip to Lockheed Martin. So we see all of these interconnections now very clearly.
And that was the first round with Patty. And remember, Soros was right there with them. But Patty, working with Marconi, set the example, the archetypal example of how the monopoly of all tech companies should work, and then led Marconi into Serco until Serco literally owns the majority of what our own military has as the equipment that they use to spy on our enemies, not realizing that the Brits are our number one enemy. How do we know that? Because George Soros has given $1.5 billion to the Digital Forensic Research Laboratory, which went straight to Richard Allen and Nick Clegg at Facebook so that they could do the Tavistock PSYOP manipulation of all of the people who
on
Facebook.
It's easier than that, because we actually can see from the General Service Administration all of the Serco contracts that are let with the Department of Defense, and most specifically with Navy Space Wars. And those contracts are out there for anybody to see.
Oh, you and us, we've proven it so many times and given you so much information on Serco, the great octopus, the biggest company nobody's ever heard of, which right now is being sued for, I think, $86 billion for not being able to produce more than 65% of the work that they do throughout the different United Kingdom associations in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and England. Basically, Serco is faltering, and it will probably just go into another name. But in America, it won't matter because it has all of its own American company names.
They have over 250 subsidiaries.
Precisely. And all of those go back to the Privy Council. So we're talking about a few people. We're talking about Geoffrey Patty being there with Marconi. But right now, it's Lord Malloch-Brown, who was on the foundation of George Soros's Open Society Foundation. He's a number one election rigger, one of the biggest ones in the world. He's on the Privy Council. He is directly giving to Facebook all the money they need to carry out the PSYOPs for the last election and for the election before that through Strategic Communications Laboratory. We've proven all of these things. Cambridge Analytica was nothing more than the tip of the iceberg. But we can see even with Brexit, that's another fake election that they're trying to conduct with George Soros people on the street. So what we're seeing is the same group of people going right back to the British Privy Council. And we can't say for sure it's the Queen or Philip or whoever, but I'll tell you what, the British monarchy still rules the world. The sun never sets on the British kingdom, yes, but electronically, it never sets at all. Because electronically, from the moment that these electronic companies, these tech companies started, including Marconi, they were controlled by the Brits, and they're still controlled to this very day. And Facebook is a perfect example. And why would you need the Deputy Prime Minister of England to come over to control Facebook? Think of it, folks, because it is Tavistock. It is Columbia University. It's Stanford. It's Harvard. It's the same old people, same old story. And they own, of course, Avid and ISIS Management, which creates the entire mainstream media echo chamber that is repeated on every single channel, including the conservative channels. It's the same old control. And who has always controlled that? Those were bankers. That's the Rothschilds owned Reuters and owns Reuters Thompson. The Rothschilds initially owned the companies that owned the Associated Press. So it is the bankers and the brokers.
Well, we go back to, if we look at the beginnings of Tavistock in 1919, actually, let's the new one, the Tavistock Institute in 1946, was hastily formed out of the British War Office and privatized with money from the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and the British royal family. That is the current version of the Tavistock Institute.
And what we need to remember is they create a boogeyman. They create an enemy, because without an enemy, you can't have a Cold War. You can't have a warm war. You can't have a war. And if you can't have a war, then the bankers can't make money off of both sides. So the Tavistock Institute, from the beginning, demonized the Germans, later demonized the Russians. You got to demonize somebody. And as they use these images, and that's what people don't understand, memes, images. In the old days, what was on the newspaper, you believed. No one disbelieved if there was a picture on the newspaper or in the news. You believed.
Well, if Walter Cronkite said it, we believed it.
Absolutely, and that's the way it was. What we forgot is that in the early 60s, we started imprinting subliminal programming into advertising and into political statements and into anything anybody wanted to broadcast. And so from the early 60s, and now it is so sophisticated that you can broadcast a perception management neural network image into your brain from your phone if it's off and nowhere near you. You only have to be...
Well, this is certainly the reason none of the Facebook executives will or Apple will let their kids use technology. They know what's going on.
What did they say from the beginning? Do no evil? Why would they have to tell themselves to do no evil unless evil was their business? That's like a person who says, look, I'm going to tell you the truth. Well, what do they tell otherwise? You tell who you are by the little statements that you start your little phrases off with. And if you're going to say, that you're not going to do evil, well, then what is Dragonfly? What is the Chinese social credit system? What is the social credit system that's already appeared on Google, on Gmail, on Facebook? What about the 100% surveillance of all Americans? Everyone knows it and no one does a thing about it. But in other countries, they've sued Google, they've sued Facebook and other companies for billions, and they won, and they had to pay up because they do what? They steal everything. They go into your Gmails. They sell everything. To say recently that the CEO of Facebook said they do not surveil nor sell information on Facebook users is the biggest piece of insanity on the face of the earth. Anyone can go in and buy anybody else's. There's two different levels you can buy. It's usually around $5. It's insane to deny it, but when you tell a big lie, people believe it. The Tavistock Institute learned from Kaiser Wilhelm's Institute, which literally was the basis of their entire scientific investigation in Germany at the time, starting in about 1911 or so. They literally pulled people's brains out of their head to see how they worked, okay? PSYOPs? No, we're talking about the worst psychological, physical, behavioral manipulation ever in history was handed from the Germans to the Tavistock Institute, literally the same scientist, and then through paperclip came to America, and through MK Ultra, and through the Tavistock implantations in many universities in America, right into the mainstream media, right into Washington, D.C. It is so friggin' thick that when you say Tavistock, you basically say Coca-Cola. You say cigarettes. You say the British American Tobacco Company. You talk about the biggest criminals who have murdered more people. You're talking about Monsanto.
Oh, I need to tell you, when you mentioned British American Tobacco Company, they list that in one of their 1917 reports as a major contributor to the dissemination of British propaganda worldwide. And that company still operates all over the planet.
Well, let's just look at that for a minute. British American Tobacco United moved to England, and now their headquarters happens to be right next to the Integrity Initiative, which we have pointed out is nothing more than another Tavistock Propaganda Institute. But why not? Because to convince people to smoke cigarettes, you have to convince them to take a poison into their body that they know is a poison from the first drag. And then you have to convince them to keep doing that until they kill themselves. Because smoking is nothing more than slow suicide. But these companies are so good at propaganda that they paid a little bit of money in America, moved to Britain, now they're protected, now they're doing it to everyone worldwide. And let's just look at the conservative estimates. 440,000 people conservatively, directly attributable by doctors' notes at the moment of death to tobacco in America. Multiply that times 5 or 6, that's the truth in America. Multiply that times worldwide, and you're talking about more people have died due to tobacco than most of the wars in modern history. Most people don't understand that iatrogenic death by doctor, is the number one death in the world, and particularly in Western developed countries. So, pharmaceutical drugs, tobacco, hospitals, doctors, how did they convince us to do all of these things?
Well,
that's the
when you take the long view of these new discoveries about Marconi and the Marconi wireless, which included encryption from the beginning, and you take the long view of what these people and their offspring, and they do give the power to the next generation of offspring. So it's either by royal connection or just by family inheritance. We're getting into grandchildren and great-grandchildren of these people who began this process. But what I think is really hard, it was hard for me to get a handle on, is how can any agenda be maintained over 100 years, which is what we're looking at here. In fact, if you look at today, 1999, or 2019, we're talking almost exactly 100 years of the passing on of this strategy. But what we have to layer onto this is that the people that we're looking at were all, at the time, progressive leftists. And then the psychiatrists that got involved with the Tavistock Institute were all progressive leftists. They were into the agenda we see now in the hard left in the Democratic Party. And their attitudes toward property, privacy, male-female relations, pharmaceuticals, they were heavy then and still are in eugenics, in actually getting rid of a certain amount of the population. So we layer onto this the fact that they have controlled the electronic wireless media since for 100 years, and now we see what Serco and others like that are implementing with a lot of this 5G technology, and they are also heavy, by the way, in investments in pharmaceuticals, one of which in England is well known, called the Wellcome Trust. And I forget what their name is in the U.S. But bottom line is, it very much appears that their current strategy is to use 5G in combination with pharmaceutical poisoning to implement their eugenics agenda to dramatically lower the population, of course, without our permission and by and large without our knowledge. And that was one of the big strategies that they used way back in 1914 was to, in fact, we actually have the minutes of a speech that the founder of the Wellington House gave where he discussed the fact that they had to implement their strategy by stealth, in secret. Now, nothing's changed. That continues to be, but now, hopefully, the world's waking up and we're realizing that this stealth, which they have been successful at for 100 years, is no more.
Yes, and your point is so well taken. So many of these organizations thank the Jesuits because they follow their organization based upon the way the Jesuits ran theirs as a paramilitary organization for the Vatican. But go back to the way the Vatican runs. How did it run for 2,000 years? Because the number one propaganda is preached from the pulpit. And you have a captive audience. They have to come every Sunday or else they go to hell. And they have to have a secret order, a society of men who wear dresses and dress up in all kinds of fancy dresses and have fancy rituals, and they're the only ones who can contact God. And without them, you can't contact God, and you can't get forgiven, and you can't receive Holy Communion, you can't have any of the sacraments.
Well, that's funny. That's funny, Douglas. I didn't get that memo.
Oh, well, if you're a Roman Catholic like me, you were raised this way, and you were propagandized every single Sunday, and you believed every word that you were told because those people couldn't possibly be lying. So that's how they do it. The British then and the monarch.
Well, I know many very deeply committed Roman Catholics, so I don't think you're talking about the average person in the pew, are you? You're talking about Jesuits.
I'm talking about Jesuits and the inner order of the way the Catholic Church has maintained control for 2,000 years. Because to this very day, why do we listen to Pope Francis, who tells us that the same thing George Soros tells us? George Soros is an economic terrorist. He has killed more people than maybe any other individual on the face of the earth. He is responsible for the collapse of more economies than any person on the face of the earth. And he preaches the same exact content as Pope Francis, because open society, open borders is liberation theology of the Jesuits. So the present Pope is not like Pope Paul, who was a saint. Pope John Paul II, he was a saint. Pope Benedict, hello, he's as evil as he can possibly be. The present Pope, Pope Francis, come on, it depends on who they elect and how they got elected. This is a Jesuit.
Well, I would have to confirm that. I know St. Pope John Paul II, and he is the real deal.
Oh, yeah.
He is the real deal. And
there are many, many good people in the Catholic Church. My point is that how do they maintain their order? Why is it that $4.5 billion has been paid out in Jesuit payoffs for pedophilia and for the attacks upon young people in the Catholic Church in America, and not one Jesuit priest has gone to jail, not one has been indicted, not one has been convicted? They simply paid the debt, moved those priests out, and played like they're all dead. And that's what's happening.
Oh, by the way, we now have the records confirming that Marconi helped the Vatican set up a wireless capability at the Vatican in the first decade of the 1900s.
Well, yes, the Vatican Bank is, it's a mafia bank. It's the biggest corrupt bank, well, one of the largest corrupt banks in the world. And so they had their own inner network, and their network was ran by the Jesuits, who were, as I say, a paramilitary organization, who were literally take a vow that pre-forgives them if they have to kill somebody for the Pope. And that is not an exaggeration. This is the way that it was back in the old days. Because in the old days, remember, the Pope also had his own army and might have a wife or two and many children, and so on and so forth. So what we're talking about is the Frankfurt School. Many people want to say that the influence of Tavistock came from the degradation created by the absolutely clear intent to socially create chaos in the world and to degrade every single morality and every single virtue that can be found in the world, and that they used people like Orwell and Aldous Huxley and H.G. Wells and
Right.
and Freud.
Oh yeah, those they were on the list. They're in the notes from the Cabinet Office. H.G. Wells specifically, and Huxley as well. But here, I have a question for you. So that they actually brought H.G. Wells in before it became Tavistock, when it was just the Wellington House. So initially they just used writers, very talented writers. But I have a question for you. Since they morphed the control of the Wellington House into Tavistock and psychiatry, how does that relate to the Jesuit influence in your mind?
Well, the Jesuits are the kings of liberation theology, in other words, Marxism, in other words, the far left, and you pointed this out. All these people involved with Tavistock used the same far left tactics. Now, those tactics go so far left, they're not democratic, they're not social democratic, they are fascist. You could say Nazi, but we're talking fascism, whether it's French, Italian, German fascism, doesn't matter. This is British fascism. It was called the Fabian Society. And these people, they were the inner group, and they believed in these progressive ideas, but the progressive ideas were basically to take society down so that you would need the church as your opiate, so that you would need drugs as your opiate, so you would need entertainment and sports as your opiate, and so they could control you. And how do they do this? Secret societies, dressing up with their clothes, fancy clothes, secret handshakes, the whole thing, the inner group. And these were the Fabians. These were the Pilgrim Society. In America, the British came over and did it in the proper British way. They had dinners. And at these dinners, they told Americans what they were going to do to them, and that the Americans would agree because they were being paid off the entire way, like the Warburgs and the bankers, the Morgans, don't get me started on the list. You know the list. You only need to name about 36 families, and you have the people who are the military-industrial complex. But anyway, the Pilgrim Society, they would meet, and they'd have these groups. And pretty soon, if you were really, really cool, then you were brought into the round table, the secret round table. And if you were then political, you were brought into the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And on the American side, the Council on Foreign Relations. You have to be invited into this group. You could be the top person in America, but you're only invited if you have no morals. If you are immoral, and if you understand that this was founded literally by the Catholic Church and by the Rockefellers as a way to undermine U.S. foreign policy. And to this very moment, the Council on Foreign Relations, up until the time of Trump's election, ran America and has since its inception. And this came directly out of these secret groups who are working out of the same type of ilk. And that ilk is that the elite, that the Jesuits, that the Vatican, that the City of London, that the monarchs, that the monarchy of Europe, they deserve more than us common people. And we don't deserve to know anything. And so they have committees. Nobody knows who's on those committees. And yet those committees have ran things for decades, and as you say, will be passed down to their children as a dynasty, just like little Richie Allen, you demonstrated, is the dynasty of Tavistock that has come to Facebook and now is so open with the lie that they don't even realize that they have stuck their foot in their mouth by taking the worst person they possibly could to represent Tavistock psyops and put them in charge, two of them, in charge of international relations for Facebook. This shows the audacity of the British Privy Council. This shows the audacity of Lord Paddy and Lord Malloch.
Well, could it also show the deterioration of their controls? Because it doesn't seem like, in studying all these people, that these current Clegg and Baron Richard have the skill set to really pull off what some of these guys, the older guys, did, and their parents and grandparents. It looks like maybe it's falling apart.
That goes to the point exactly, and the point of what I wanted to make today. And that is, yes, they are coming apart at the fringes. Someone is pulling the thread from their crocheted sweater. They are losing it to the point that they have to send their top people to try to protect it, and yet it is now exposed 100%. Why? It's faltering, it's failing. Why? Well, Marconi showed us what happens. When you create something that is beyond what the individual human being can actually comprehend, then that human being may become enslaved to it. For instance, we created wireless, and then that created the ability for war to move faster.
By the way, I haven't seen that Marconi himself was into this strategy. We need to do more digging, but it appears like once everybody began to realize how powerful it was, they co-opted him.
I think you said it best. They probably just they just consumed him. I don't know what happened to him in the end, but
just like they stole my technology. And when it became useful to them, they just pushed the inventor out of the way and grabbed it.
That's what GE, I think, did exactly to Marconi, and the British Privy Council did by simply absorbing him. And now you would know more about Geoffrey Patty than you would about Marconi. So when these things are invented, they become such powerful entities, mechanical, technical, machine-driven reason, not intellect and not human thought. And what do? They enslave you. And so therein lies the problem. Facebook has enslaved everyone who thought that they were controlling it as a psyops. Now it controls them. As a matter of fact, their entire life, their dynasty of Tavistock is put on the line for the fact that Dude Zuckerberg and the lie that he stole his technology from later technologies and from your people and then claimed it as his own. That's as big a lie as saying the Queen is not in charge of the world. So what we're doing is we are showing that the technology is now reverting. And now the technology is consuming the very people who thought that they could steal it from other people, from their patents, manipulate it, and control it. They now know they cannot control it. And the PSYOPs experiment weaponization of social media is reverting. And now you see that it's collapsing. It went too far in the European Union. George Soros went too far. Now you see the other nations saying, forget migrants, forget George Soros, forget open borders. We want Brexit. We want a free Italy. We want a free Poland. We want a free Romania. We're seeing that around the world, people are waking up saying, oops, Eric Schmidt and his Dragonfly and social credit system in China. Oh my gosh, that's the enslavement of the world that all the sci-fi dystopias talk about. Are we going to wake up? Are we going to pinch ourselves and come out of this sleep where we are serving these machines and realize we need to be the masters of the machines? Because right now, we are not the masters of electromagnetic frequencies that are killing us and all these devices that go far beyond what most humans can comprehend because they are doing us in. And as you say, no Facebook executive allows their child to go anywhere near Facebook. So the point is, what you have discovered is the archetypal example that is happening with every social media. It's happening with every stolen invention that they weaponize because they take the morality out of the invention of the person who created it, out of the person who deserves the patent, who has the morality and thought it through, and they give it over to the military. They weaponize it, and now it is out of control. And so your research, every time that you speak with us, your research takes it the next step. And so we thank you because this, we understand, is just the beginning of what you're about to reveal in some articles that are about to come out with the researchers you're working with. And so we look forward to that. And we can't thank you enough for again and again bringing to our consciousness those things that we oftentimes forget. And as they arise in our consciousness, we can create the consciousness of critical mass that can change these things, create a moratorium, create a manifesto that says we do not go for machine thinking. We go for human thinking. We go for thoughts that come out of human hearts, not...
Right. And that's what I'm hoping that all this research will do as people get hard data, not just people's opinion, but hard data to form their opinion, then we will see an arising. What was that rock song? That was actually our trial theme song was, I can't remember the name of the song now. But anyway, that the facts, the truth, will set us free. And that's really what we're trying to get to the larger audience, because these truths have affected every human being on the planet. And we now see that they're run and controlled by evil people. And the question is, do we as human beings trying to live good lives want to be continually controlled by these people? My answer is no.
As long as you continue to pull the rug out from underneath them, they are off balance, and we have the chance to turn the tables. And it is truth that's going to win the day. So thank you for bringing the truth up from the minds with all your researchers, for all your friends over at Americans for Innovation.
Thanks for all our researchers.
Oh, my goodness. And thanks for all your devoted followers and helpers at Leader Technologies, and for all the good work that you do, because it is amazing every time we speak with you. So thank you so much for your good research and for bringing the truth to light, Michael.